session as you're joining us. We'll plan to wait till right after 9 o'clock to get started. But for now, just make sure your microphone is on mute if at all possible. You can have your video on if you want to be in community, but that's optional, and just hang out. And thanks for joining us. Hello to those who are just joining us. We'll wait maybe one more minute to get started since the numbers continue to creep higher and higher, which is awesome to see. But just please make sure that your microphone is muted. You're welcome to have your video on if you want to be in community, but audio muted will just make it most comfortable for Angelica. All right, 9:01, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the second or first day of ISCORE. My name is Tessa Bro. I use she, her, hers, and I work in LAS Career Services, and I'm serving as a volunteer facilitator today. And I'll let Kevin introduce himself.
Good morning, I'm Kevin Flaming, he, him. I work in the College of Veterinary Medicine with a team that develops web-based training on foreign animal diseases. I'll be the moderator today and summarizing the questions for Angelica. Feel free to go ahead and ask the questions during the session, but we're going to hold those until the end for her to answer. When asking the questions, please use the chat in the Whova browser window. It's over on the right. There's a Q&A tab. Next to it, it says Q&A, polls, chat, and community. Please don't use the one in Zoom or in the Zoom window within Whova. That way we've got them all corralled into one area. So thanks. Back to you, Tessa.
So a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. As Kavan mentioned, the Whova app will be the basis for our questions. Please remember that while participating and engaging at ISCORE, you should follow Iowa State's Netiquette guidelines and the principles of community. And we're also trying to make sure everyone remembers to submit surveys. In non-pandemic times, they were those paper forms, but Whova has that virtual functionality. You can either find it on the left menu under surveys or underneath the session title. If you scroll, there is a button that says rate session. So in either of those locations, you can leave great feedback for Angelica, and those will be emailed to her so she can know just how awesome she did. So now for the presentation. Angelica Castro Bueno, she, her, hers, is a second-year graduate student in the Counseling Psychology PhD program. She works with Dr. David Vogel, investigating stigma related to mental health, help-seeking, and identity. She hopes to one day work in community mental health with underserved populations. So now, I'll turn it over to Angelica for her presentation, Far from Angels, Examining DACA Recipients' Lived Experiences of Stigma.
Thank you, Tessa. And welcome everyone, good morning. I'm very excited to present on a topic that's very important to me, the stigmatized experiences of DACA recipients. Well, let's get started. Before I begin, I want you to stop and reflect. Ask yourself, what do I think of when I hear the term undocumented immigrant? What about illegal immigrant? What about DACA recipient? All three of these terms are used to describe the population that is the target of this study, DACA recipients. And as we can see from these images, and as we're hearing these terms, many stereotypes, both positive and negative, are attached to this group. As you listen to this talk, I invite you to pause and to reflect. Notice the thoughts, reactions, and emotions that are coming up for you when you think of this group. Okay, so to begin, I want to review several terms that I will be using throughout this presentation. The first one is DACA, which stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program. This program was started in 2012. It was enacted via executive order by former President Barack Obama. And it granted 2 years of protection from deportation and employment authorization for those who received it. Importantly, you have to reapply every 2 years. It is not a path towards citizenship. Those are both very important factors here. The second term is DACA recipient, which is just a way of communicating that somebody has been granted DACA status. It doesn't necessarily imply active DACA status. A lot of the criteria and eligibility and just having to reapply every 2 years means that people who at one point held DACA status might not currently have it, might not currently be able to get it. Undocumented immigrant is a term used to describe an individual who has no lawful status. So this is kind of where it gets tricky because DACA recipients have temporary limited protection, but they are somewhere in between undocumented immigrant and a documented immigrant. So they're in an in-between space. At the same time, growing up before DACA, they were undocumented immigrants, so they have those experiences of having no protection. And these last terms, illegal immigrant, illegal alien, and unauthorized alien are alternatives used to describe undocumented immigrants. They level in their level of disparagement, and we will not be using these in this presentation, and I ask that you don't use these as well. The only times we'll use it is if we're directly quoting a participant or someone else. So, let's continue. Okay, so DACA eligibility criteria, as you can see here, are pretty extensive. There are age, time frame, legal and education and military service requirements. In general, you have to be at least 15 years of age to apply for DACA, and you have to have arrived to the US before the age of 16. You also have to have been under the age of 31 by June 15, 2012. Here we see that individuals must have continuously resided in the United States since June 15, 2007, up until the present time. And they must also meet these education requirements, have a diploma or GED, or have served in the military in some way and been honorably discharged. They also cannot have any serious crimes or pose a threat to national security. Now, you might be asking yourself, why June 15, 2012? It seems kind of random. And honestly, it really is. This is the date that Barack Obama announced that the DACA program would be starting. So that's why on that day, it just kind of fell that way. And that means it's really arbitrary and people are excluded for not meeting these arbitrary requirements. If you have a person who turned 32 on June 14th, 2012, and they meet all of the other requirements, they still cannot get DACA. The cutoff is very strict that way. All right. I also thought it would be helpful to do a really brief overview of the legislative history of this program. Starting in June 15, 2012, when it was announced, and then in August, they began accepting applications. So very, very quick turnaround, considering the long history of undocumented immigrants hoping for a path towards citizenship or protection or work authorization. In 2017, President Trump announced the plan to end the DACA program. And very soon after, the University of California and others filed suit on behalf of their DACA students, basically asking that this was considered like inappropriate, that it shouldn't be rescinded. We see some other lawsuits, we see judges blocking orders, and then in June 18th, 2020, the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration. So DACA remained active. I really wanted to include this timeline to show kind of the experience of someone who has DACA, the ups and downs when it was upheld, rescinded, paused, all of these things. When your ability to work, to drive, and to feel safe depend on this program, these changes are really meaningful and they're really damaging. I also recently, just yesterday, heard that the Dream and Promises Act of 2021 was reintroduced into Congress. And if passed, it would give individuals a path towards citizenship. In particular, DACA recipients would have a path towards citizenship. However, it has been introduced in the past and was not passed. So at this point, it's a hope, but we can see that even today, even yesterday, major changes are happening all the time. And so knowing that, let's look at some numbers. So currently in the United States, there are 640,000 active DACA recipients. In Iowa, that number is 2,420. So really small proportion of the total number of DACA recipients. The top 3 countries of origin of these recipients, as we can see, are Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So Latinx countries disproportionately represent DACA recipients. I also wanted to include this slide because in our study, we focused on the experience of Latinx individuals. There are a total of about 158 countries of origin for DACA recipients. And so it's like, it's just very, it would be unhelpful to generalize across all of these countries, the experiences. So even knowing that Latinx countries are, heterogeneous, we kind of wanted to restrict it to just kind of get a better picture of this particular subgroup's experiences of DACA. And now I want you to pause. I gave you a ton of information in a short amount of time. So I want you to think to yourself, what did I learn? Like, what surprised me? How has my understanding of this group changed? And what do I think of DACA recipients now? I'm gonna give you about 10 seconds to just think this over in your head. Okay. So with all of these thoughts and reactions and emotions in your mind, I want you to keep those in mind as we talk about stigma. We'll be using Crocker, Major and Steele's definition of stigma that reads, a person whose social identity or membership in some social category calls into question his or her full humanity. The person is devalued, spoiled, or flawed in the eyes of others. Now, what does that mean? And what does it look like? It's really difficult to say because stigma is really difficult to define. It varies based on societal, situational, and individual factors. Depending on the context, a condition can be either very highly stigmatized or not stigmatized at all. And it can also be expressed in overtly via things like social rejection, think being told you can't sit with us, or more covertly, such as in tense situations. And it is also active on both explicit and implicit levels, so both more conscious and unconscious levels. So individuals may not even really be consciously aware of the stigma that's happening and the stigma they're experiencing in the moment, which all makes it really hard to pinpoint when stigma is occurring. Now, with all that being said, there's a few common features that characterize stigma. The first is that we know that stigma is a negative experience of devaluation. Someone is considered less than for holding a stigmatized condition. Stigma also exists in social interactions. We have to have at least two individuals, one who is the stigmatizer and one who is the target of the stigma, in order for the process to occur. And finally, targets of stigma tend to be of lower status and power. And this is true across societies and in different contexts. And this also lets us know that individuals who occupy lower positions in society are more at risk for being stigmatized. All right, now to break down this very complex and multifaceted phenomenon, we will be using Pryor and Reeder's model of stigma. And in this model, they break down stigma into 4 parts. At the center, we have public stigma, and that feeds and is fed into by structural stigma, self-stigma, and stigma by association. So public stigma is defined as people's social and psychological reactions to someone with a perceived stigma. This is what most people think of when they're asked to define what stigma is. This is stigma endorsed by the general population. Now, where do people get information about what is stigmatized? We know that things like political rhetoric, news, and media sources all contribute to the stigma a group faces. Here we have a quote from former President Donald Trump. I'm sure you've read it or heard it before, that shows stigma in action. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. When an individual with this much power and influence disparages a group, it really impacts the perceptions of this group and the stigma that they face. Okay. Self-stigma, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. So it describes the social and psychological impacts individuals experienced when they are the targets of stigma. So this process leads to the internalization of negative stereotypes about yourself and about your own group, and negative emotional reactions such as shame and disappointment are then converted into things like self-blame and internalized racism. In this quote, an undocumented participant describes the internalized shame they experienced when they considered disclosing their status in order to get services. It reads, "Well, I feel ashamed. I debated so many times whether to tell my counselor, because you're just so scared to tell somebody because you don't know what they're going to think. And you're just so scared of that reaction. You feel inferior because you know they have more rights than you." And finally, we have structural stigma. So structural stigma is the legitimization and perpetuation of a stigmatized status by society's institutions and ideological systems. Institutions include organizations like the legal system, our education system, occupational systems. So Iowa State University would be included here. And the consequences of this stigma is that this group's access to resources and support are really constricted. They're very limited. In this quote, an undocumented worker is pressured to stay late by their employer. It reads, "Oh, you can't stay late? Well, then good luck finding another job that's not going to look past your status." So here we can see how this system that privileges the employer leads to the marginalization, the negative experiences that this individual faces. Okay. We're going to pause again. Thinking of what you just learned about stigma, what did you learn? Maybe consider, how have I experienced these types of stigma in my life? Okay, so now we'll transition to my study. So previous qualitative research has examined the experience of DACA recipients related to their documentation status. However, this research has been largely concentrated in areas that have high undocumented immigrant populations, such as California and Arizona. And it also has not had an in-depth examination of how and what individuals experience related to documentation status stigma. It kind of accepts stigma as a major force, and it's super important and impactful, but it doesn't really go in depth and disentangle the different types and experiences that individuals face. So that is our goal, to understand this phenomenon better. And here are the research questions that we will use to address these issues. One is, what are DACA recipients' experience of stigma in their lives? Very broadly, we want to know what they're experiencing and how they're experiencing it. We also want to know, have DACA recipients experienced public, structural, and self-stigma in their lives? Many individuals do not know about these different types of stigma. So we want to know that if we describe each type, can individuals pinpoint okay, yeah, I've had that experience. I didn't know that was a name for it, but yeah, I've had that in my life. And the third is, what factors or identities have contributed to DACA recipients' experiences of stigma? With this question, we specifically wanted to look at things like identities and other factors such as socioeconomic status, and how all of those have kind of worked together to contribute to this experience. And to do that, we asked about the current sociopolitical climate and how that has affected DACA recipients, and how DACA recipients cope with those experiences. So our procedure was, we recruited one DACA recipient living in Iowa. We then conducted a single in-depth, semi-structured interview via WebEx. I transcribed the interview and then performed some accuracy and trustworthy checks, and then analyzed the data. So for our study, we had a participant whose pseudonym was Hazel. She was a 28-year-old woman who was employed as a nurse. She was primarily raised in the Midwest, and she was currently living in Iowa. So these are the interview questions, the interview protocol we used with this participant. We started off by defining stigma as a person who is disqualified from full social acceptance. And we asked, have you experienced stigma as we defined it? We also introduced the idea that being undocumented is a potentially stigmatized identity. And we asked whether they believed this was true. We also asked broadly about the United States, and then narrowed it down to hometown, and then narrowed it down to the individual level, getting at that self-stigma. And then the third question was, broadly, any other identities that you believe have been stigmatized in the United States? And then asking about the sociopolitical climate, what impact has that had on these experiences? And we used Nustaca's data analysis approach to analyze it. And overall, the themes that emerged were different in a bad way, multiple morally deficient identities, and it comes from a lot of different places and in a lot of different forms. For theme 1, the meaning units that emerged were othering and differences as negative. So Hazel described how these contributed to her feelings of fear and negative evaluation. She said, "Well, growing up, I felt like I was a very shy child. And even though I didn't necessarily fully grasp what it meant to be illegal, I know it was something bad, and it was something that could get not only myself, but my whole family in trouble." From this quote, we see that even at a young age, information about a stigmatized condition is being communicated to those who hold it. And considering how negative Hazel's emotional experience was, it's easy to see how this experience would have lasting negative impacts on her throughout her life. The second theme that emerged was multiple morally deficient identities. And the meaning units that we found were documentation status stigma, Latinx identity stigma, and stigma as a double-edged sword. Hazel gave examples of her perceptions of public stigma towards undocumented individuals. So, well, there's always the stigma that illegal immigrants are criminals. She also described how being stigmatized can be negative, but it can also be motivating to disprove inaccurate representations. She said, it's a double-edged sword because it just makes me want to prove people wrong. At the same time, it's so easy to use that as justification to, not do something that you were wanting to do, but maybe intimidated by. So to me, it can either really motivate you to change people's perceptions of that, or it can really hold you down and keep you down. Hazel reported feeling stigmatized for being undocumented and for being a Latinx person. And as she said here, those intersecting identities and their effects can really have negative effects on people. There is an upside, there is that resilience factor, there is that wanting to prove people wrong. And at the same time, it has the power to, like she said, hold you down and keep you down. And then the third theme that emerged, it comes from a lot of different places and a lot of different forms. The meaning units were the media, colleagues, and community. Hazel explained that messages about stigma come from a variety of sources. In her case, a salient experience of stigma came from her predominantly white community. It reads, "I know when I was younger, I struggled a lot more with it. And that's mostly because of just, hearing when you live in a white conservative community, comments that people make that they don't take for being impactful is something that sticks with me." So this theme highlights how stigma can be communicated in really subtle ways that might not be obvious even to those who are communicating it, and yet the impact is still there, and the impact is still negative. From these themes, I developed a composite description of Hazel's experience of stigma. It reads, "Hazel experienced stigma as a negative evaluation, holding negative intersecting stigmatized identities, and by perceiving stigma from many sources. Hazel experienced devaluation at a young age, not always understanding why, but knowing that it was bad and dangerous for her and her family. As she grew older, Hazel endured painful comments from her mostly white community that did not always realize the impact of their words. These experiences culminated in Hazel feeling that several of her identities, being undocumented and Latinx, were devalued, resulting in intersecting levels of marginalization." This is the last time I'll ask you to stop and reflect. Thinking of that composite description, thinking of Hazel's experience of stigma. How has my understanding and perception of DACA recipients changed? What questions do I have moving forward? And what can I do to combat documentation status stigma? I wanted to include this photo. This is not Hazel, but this is a real DACA recipient. So DACA recipients are in our communities. They're essential workers. During this pandemic especially, they have a vital role, and they also face a lot of stigma that compounds other experiences of marginalization, such as hoping that this Dream and Promises Act is passed. So at the very end, I just wanted to leave you with this last quote from Donald Trump. Many of the people in DACA, no longer very young, are far from angels. Some are very tough, hardened criminals. So this is where I got my title. I think it really captures stigma. It really captures how stigma can be dangerous and inaccurate framing of this population. Just considering the fact that statistics on crime related, committed by undocumented immigrants show that they commit less crime than both documented immigrants and US citizens. We can see that even though Trump tweeted this statement and probably had a lot of influence on a lot of his followers, it's still untrue, unsupported by data. I would argue that because it's inaccurate, its purpose is to perpetuate the stigma that DACA recipients experience. But I wanted to hear all of your thoughts, so I will open it up to questions.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, well, I know I'm an advisor, of course, and I have only had one student just say, I think we were talking about financial aid and that sort of thing, and she was with her mother, I think, and she just kind of leaned over the desk and real quietly said, I'm not eligible. And I'm like, well, why not? I wasn't, and she said, because she didn't exactly say it. She didn't come out and say it, but I understood right away what she was talking about. I can't remember exactly I didn't know what to say to her. Wasn't sure how to react to that. How to make her feel better about it, or, I just said, I understand. And I just kind of left it at that. But, other than that, I've not really run into too much, although I do live up in Perry, Iowa. And we have a lot of, I believe a lot of Latinos and a lot of people who, I don't know if that's the proper term, but a lot of people who may or may not be undocumented, but they're actually the majority of the population now. So I think it's had a kind of a cool influence on the community in the, just their traditions and I just think it's really kind of awesome myself. But.
Thank you. That's such an important point. You have this one experience with an undocumented student. At the same time, a part of that stigmatization and that fear is that people don't disclose when they're undocumented. So you have this experience and it seems like this person really struggled to debate, do I disclose this? Do I explain what's going on for me? And that reaction is very natural. Not knowing what to do, because you really can't do much. It's at the legislative level. I want to ask you, when you heard that, what did you experience? Like thoughts, feelings? What happened for you?
I just felt really bad for her. That was my reaction, and then it was like, what do I say? I wasn't sure how to make her feel. I wanted to make her feel more comfortable, or that it would be all right, but I couldn't really say that because I didn't know, I don't know what her options are, which are probably pretty limited, but, I wasn't uncomfortable in her telling me that. I just was uncomfortable with not being able to respond very well.
That makes so much sense. Yes. Thank you for that reaction. That's so important and so common to experience. People don't know much about DACA. It's complicated, one, but two, it also changes. And we don't really talk about it. So part of the way we target stigma, try to get rid of it, is through education, through just knowing more. And especially in this presentation, I wanted to privilege the voices of people who experience it. I want it from their own words, because so many times they're silenced through fear and through these other reactions. So thank you so much for sharing.
Well, and I'll just share real quick. We have a family in Perry. I don't know them, but I heard about it through somebody else, whose parents had to go home, but they stayed. And the 16-year-old, there were 3 of them, and the 16-year-old was basically in charge of them. So somebody that worked at the school just sort of took it upon herself to be, to help them out and to do that sort of thing. But they've been separated from their parents for a long time, and you just don't know, what all these things are doing to the children, and how much they're having to struggle.
Absolutely. For DACA recipients, in particular, because they grew up this way, they moved to the US at a really young age. Like those effects, the effects of being undocumented, the effects of being separated from family, that's all just so compounded. And then just to add the stigma on top of that as another layer is a lot. It's a lot to handle.
Well, thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Angelica, we're getting a number of questions in the chat. A couple of them are related to this conversation. One is, how can I fight the stigma of documentation? Immigration status is confidential. How can I support undocumented immigrants? And then someone kind of follows on that. Does research identify external factors that minimize various forms of stigma and those who are experiencing it? So, how can we respond personally, and what does research say about responding or minimizing stigma?
Those are 2 really great questions. To address the first one, in one of my slides, I showed a picture of 4 individuals holding signs, and they were a little difficult to read, but basically they said things like, I am undocumented, or I'm an ally, I'm an unafraid ally, or I'm undocumented and unafraid. And so that is a really important step to take, is identify yourself as a safe person. And one way that we do that, I know we do it in the psychology department here at ISU, is this just a little printout, and it says like, this is a DACA safe zone. And basically that shows that you're there, you're an ally, you're a supporter, which for most people, they would pass by and they wouldn't really get it. They wouldn't understand. It's not obvious. But to people who hold that and who constantly evaluate every situation they're in for safety and support, like they will see that, and that's really important to them. So I would encourage anyone who works with DACA individuals, teachers, professors, anybody, to have a sign like that, to let people know their views, that there's someone safe they can talk to, because like we said, it's confidential, so you wouldn't know that otherwise. I know the university here doesn't really keep track of DACA recipients due to safety things. They don't want, if the government subpoenas things, they don't want to make it easy for them, but also, because it's really hard to track this group. They've lived in the shadows for a long time, and that's a safe place, but that can also be a really dark place. So I would encourage people to make their views known, make their allyship known. And for the second question, very great question. To combat stigma, there's different ways of going at it. I think mental health stigma is one that's been really researched, documentation status stigma less so, and it hasn't really been done. Documentation status has not really been researched quantitatively at those levels, because this is a hard to get population. Less than 1 million individuals in the whole United States, only 2,400 in Iowa. So to extrapolate from other research, we know things like education and awareness are helpful. So by educating people, we dispel a lot of inaccuracies that stigma really thrives on. This idea of being criminals, of being rapists and murderers, etc. So education is step 1. But more, in addition to that, it gets complicated for DACA recipients when there's so much danger. In the community, there's movements to do things like coming out. You come out as undocumented, you state your status, you show that you're not afraid, and it's a way of getting advocacy work done. It's also very dangerous. So I think that's another one. If people know individuals who are undocumented personally, stigma is really, I wouldn't say eradicated, but it's reduced in knowing a human who has that. Similarly to if you know someone closely who has a mental health condition, and you love them and you know them well, the stigma around that kind of is lessened. So those are two I would recommend. It's hard to say more because this population is so particular, and so there's so many nuances for them, but in general, education and contact are two good ways.
Are there organizations or communities that promote this awareness or education with DACA that we could be involved with?
Absolutely. Here in Iowa, there are several. Some are faith-based, community-based, even here at Iowa State. There is actually a DACA Scholarship that is funded by, I believe, the Latinx Student Leadership Council. And every year they give a scholarship to a DACA recipient who attends the school. In addition, in the community, I'm a member of the Amos immigration group, which is an interfaith alliance, but it really serves to support, protect, advocate for undocumented immigrants who don't really have voices of their own because of the danger associated with doubting themselves. And this group in particular during COVID has been doing a Story County immigration fund. So for COVID, there's a lot of relief packages out, funding to help people. They don't apply to undocumented immigrants. They can't access that help. And at the same time, they are disproportionately affected by things like restaurant closings, that service industry really being hit. So it's really compounded. All of those effects are compounded for them. So this group works to gather funding, donations, and to direct that towards these groups. Documentation status stigma does not matter for them. And then more broadly, there's national groups. Facebook is a great place to find them, to find these communities, and they do a lot of advocacy and work that you can help out with. Thank you.
Angelica, there's some folks, two things. One, do you have a PDF of your DACA Safe Zone sign, and could you provide a link to that if possible? And then two, what are the long-term impacts of stigma? Does it affect people physically, mentally? What are the outcomes for individuals and communities from long-term stigma?
This is definitely an area I want to go into next, looking at the long-term effects of stigmatization, especially related to documentation status. We know there are significant mental health effects. We look at things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, all of these conditions that are related to having experiences and lack of services to address them. Undocumented immigrants a lot of times don't have health insurance. And if they don't have health insurance and they have low income, how are they going to ever afford, psychological services? We know there's long-term impacts, physical, just from being in industry and work that requires so much physical exertion. But more than that, separation from family has huge impacts because individuals can't visit their families, especially DACA recipients hope that one day they'll be able to visit their homelands. Many of them don't have any memories of that. They moved too young. So all of these things cause a lot of psychological impacts. I would argue physical impacts through like somatization of symptoms, especially untreated long-term. We know they're there. I don't have any data on me now, but I would say from my previous research that pretty significant. And once again, completely underserved, undermet needs.
For the remaining questions, Angelica, would you prefer people continue to type them in the Q&A or just unmute and give you a shout out?
Yeah, I think a conversational approach would be really good. So if people want to just unmute and say their questions, that would be great. Really quick though, I forgot to answer your other question about the PDF of the poster, and I do have it, and I can make that available to everyone after this presentation.
Hi, Angelica. This is a really great presentation. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to this on-campus organization. It's called ISU Dreamers. I'm currently leading it. I put it into the chat. And if anyone here is interested in finding out ways to better support the undocumented students here at Iowa State in particular, I would highly suggest emailing us. And we are also found on Instagram. Currently, it's like the only place we're out publicly. And I wanted to ask you, Angelica, what do you suggest to Iowa State in particular for supporting the current population of undocumented students right here, and also well, let's just start there. Yeah.
Okay, that is an excellent question. First of all, I think at the Iowa State community-wise, you're doing it. Like, having this group is step one. I just saw about it, because I'm trying to start recruiting for my master's thesis, and that is amazing. Like a centralized location, that's a really great support group to have. More broadly, institutional level wise, messages of support from people like the president of the university are very helpful, especially when DACA is challenged so often, and it can really feel like at the top level institutionally people don't care. DACA recipients are being used as pawns. Like, knowing that someone cares and someone is willing to go out there and advocate is huge. And then related, it's in the little things like the financial aid office knowing what DACA is. When you go to your advisor and you can maybe mention that you're a DACA recipient, and they can understand all of the barriers you're going to face going into the workforce. I think those are major steps that can really help DACA recipients, which we don't know how many are at ISU. A previous estimate I saw was administrator said like in the single digits, but it's hard to know if that's accurate or not. So I think those are like really tangible, very simple steps that can be taken and make a huge world of difference.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments, reactions?
Hi, Angelica. I really like your presentation very much, and it's very close to my heart. I teach in the School of Education, and I have many friends that are DACA recipients. And I think one important thing for everyone is to become an ally for our DACA recipients. And that can be very open in our classrooms, staying at the beginning of the semester. Okay, this is a free environment for everyone. And another important aspect is to educate people, because there are many misconceptions and misunderstandings of the law, misunderstanding of the lives of the students and how they, the things that they have to go through and all the challenges. And if we start educating others and explaining to them, I think it's the best step. I have been doing this in my classroom, and I see other students just change their framework completely. I didn't know that. I was completely ignorant about this. And it's very important for us to speak out and to educate others. I think that's the best step, the first step that we have to do. And that's it. I'm gonna leave it like that. Thank you.
Thank you. That is the step. I would challenge people to maybe take that off the plate of DACA recipients for a minute. Like, they go through a lot, and there's only 2,400 in Iowa compared to the population of even Iowa State, how many people do they have to educate at that level, that individual level where it's really powerful? And we all have the power to do that. We don't have to be DACA recipients to know the laws or the things around them, even if it's not in depth, just understanding the basics. So powerful.
Angelica, this is Emily Hayden. I'm so excited to be here and to hear more about your research. I've been following you for a while now. And I just wanted to thank you. I think you've made a really compelling argument for the impact that stigma, as put forward by powerful individuals in our government, the impact that has on people in our own communities. And I wanted to thank you for exploring the Iowa population and exploring this impact in Iowa, which is probably more, I mean, I would suspect there are more DACA recipients in Iowa than we know. And you said something about most of the research is done in larger states where there, I really want to, and that's super important, but I really want to thank you for continuing this line of research here, and really well done, great presentation.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate it. Dr. Hayden was my qualitative methods instructor last year, a while ago. Really, really nice to hear that. Thank you so much.
Right, we have reached 9:50, so that is formally the end of the presentation, and the 10 o'clock sessions will be starting, so if people need to get up, stretch, take a break, figure out their next session, can start doing so. But Angelica, if you're fine sticking around for another minute or two, if people have remaining questions, they're welcome to stick around. But thank you for joining this session. A reminder again that you can provide feedback for Angelica either with the rate session button, which is found scrolling down in Whova beneath the title of the presentation, or in the surveys in the left menu. Then you'll have to make a few more clicks and find it there. But thanks so much for attending today, and stick around if you have more questions.